welcome to all our attendees. Thank you so much for joining us for episode 2 in our Skills to Advance webinar series. And this one's entitled Wellness in the Workplace. And we've had a huge response to it, and a huge thank you to everybody for tuning in on a Friday morning. My name is Orla Sweeney. I am the Employer Engagement Officer working here for MSLETB with my colleagues Sarah Rooney and Aidan Ty, and we look after Sligo, Mayo and Leitrim for Skills to Advance. So what we do, essentially, to give you a quick rundown, if any of you aren't familiar with it, is we work with employees, people in employment, to upskill and reskill and develop their skills moving forward within employment. So we engage quite frequently, every day, repeatedly, with employers all over our 3 counties to work with employers, helping them to increase staff morale, productivity, skill, knowledge and performance through our funded courses provided in MSLETB. So we kind of take you step by step through what we can do to engage with you and your team in providing further upskilling. And we provide all of that accredited bespoke training when you need it. And if we don't have it on offer at the moment, we will endeavour to provide it as soon as we can. If it's something that isn't available through our Skills to Advance, we work consistently developing new schemes, new training courses for enterprises, for companies all over the counties. Some of the courses that we're currently offering, just to give you an idea, are Wellness in the Workplace, which has we've just received a huge amount of requests for this course to be provided. It's very, very topical. It's something that people need consistent training in. It's something that we need to bring to the attention of employers and teams and open it up as a subject that needs to be discussed frequently going forward. And that's why we have Louise here today to talk to you further about that. And we did a course this week in Wellness in the Workplace in Kindred and Strandhill. We've another one running in Leitrim with Louise at the end of this month, so get in touch with us if you're interested in that one, and we'll have several more that we'll be rolling out in the not too distant future. We also are running Leading Through Change, which is an ILM certain leadership change and management, digital marketing, hospitality supervision, mentorship practice, among many others. So please feel free to touch base with us at any stage if we can help you within employment or as an employer. I guess, as I just mentioned there, the wellness in the workplace is a huge topic at the moment and has become an increasingly important topic for us, and one that we're finding when we're engaging with employers, they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. We don't have training in this area. We're not really sure how to create this awareness within our workplace, and we're spending a huge amount of time at work. So it's essential to prioritise our own physical and mental health and well-being on a daily basis. So we are hoping to promote this subject, to promote the facilitation of courses, so that organisations going forward can promote and create a more positive and productive environment that supports the overall well-being of their workforce. And with that all said, I would love to welcome Louise to take over the rest of the webinar. If anybody has any questions they want to pop into our Q&A box, there's an option there to send them in anonymously. And I've already received a load of questions via email, which I've submitted already to Louise, and that we might go through a couple of them at the end of the webinar. But without too much further ado, I will hand you over to the incredibly capable and wonderful Louise Dennison-O'Shaughnessy. Thanks, Louise.
Thanks so much, Orla. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here, and thank you so much for the invite, Orla. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen for a second, guys. You're all very welcome. I hope you're all keeping well this morning. Okay, so let's bring this down here. Okay. Okay, just bear with me now 1 second. Of course, when you start to do something, something happens. Story of our lives with IT.
Always.
Always, I know. Yeah. Okay. So just give me 1 second there. Okay. So guys, you're all very, very welcome to your Wellness in the Workplace webinar. My own name is Louise Dennison-O'Shaughnessy. I will move that box as soon as it allows me to move it there in a sec. Apologies. Can you all see, or can you see the screen okay there?
I can do, yeah.
That's okay. The box will be moved when it lets me move it. Okay, so we are a mental health and wellbeing training company, and we're really excited to be here today, guys. And I hope you enjoy our presentation. Okay, so what are we going to cover? This session is about giving you guys a better understanding of your thoughts, your response to stress, and how to reduce low-level conflict in the workplace. We'll continue. Okay. Are you, Orla, sorry to just pause there for a second. Is that box still, can you see that box that's covering the title there?
Yeah, understanding your thoughts, you're all good.
You're okay, that's okay. Sorry, it's just on my screen and that's okay. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at how we understand our thoughts. So firstly, guys, we're going to start with the mind. I'm going to ask you to think about how many thoughts you believe you have per day. So have a think and put a number on it for a second. Orla, I think you're the only one with a mic on, so I'm going to get you to throw out a guess for me if you don't mind. How many thoughts do you reckon we have a day, Orla?
I've done this before at a course, and can you believe I can't remember it? I would say probably 10,000.
Okay, close. I've had millions and 5, so you're in between.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have, according to the National Science Foundation, we have an average of 12,000 to 60,000 thoughts per day. So 80% of these thoughts are negative, and 95% of these thoughts are repetitive. So it's hard to fathom that out of all those thoughts, 80% are negative. And that's what we're trying to understand here today, and why that is, and how we can look at maybe improving the positive number a little bit. Okay. So a good exercise is trying to identify some of those negative thoughts and put them to the test to see, are they truly accurate in your life? So why do we imagine that 80% of our thoughts are negative? So in order to understand this, we need to go back to our ancestors. And the 80% of our thoughts is called the negativity bias. We all have it. We are born with the negativity bias. And when I say we go back to our ancestors, it's because in order for our ancestors to survive, they had to be on hyper awareness and hyper alert to dangers. They were constantly looking out. They were out hunting and gathering their food. And if they weren't on high alert to being attacked, basically, they wouldn't have survived another day. So as a result of that, over time, the structure of the brain it changed very, very slowly to become very aware of negative thoughts, become more hypervigilant for negative thoughts, okay? So our ancestors' survival depended on them being on high alert for all these threats, scanning the environment all the time for anything that could result in imminent death. So again, if you think about it logically, there's one thing to, go out and not find food in a day. You just get up hungry the next day, go look for it. But if you go out, if our ancestors went out looking to hunt and they were attacked by, I don't know, saber-toothed tiger or something like that, in reality, they wouldn't survive another day. So that's life over. So that's why we became hyper vigilant to being on the high alert for negative thoughts. Okay. So as a result of this, the structure of the brain, as I was saying, adapted very slowly to become pay much more attention to negative information than positive. I'm sure you can all remember a time in your life when, no matter all the positive things have been said to you over life, the one time where somebody made a really negative comment to you, that it still stands to you this day and it still stays with you, because we hone in on the negative. It's just how we're designed. So the negativity bias has served us well, its purpose well. We're here today, we're alive, and without it we would not be here today. But currently the issue is we are on hyper alert all the time for what's now considered perceived threats. So for our ancestors, it was real threats to survive, and now it's perceived threats for us, and it's at the core of a lot of mental health conditions such as depression, addiction, anxiety. If you think about it logically, if we're on high alert for threat all the time, our stress response is active all the time. And if our stress response is active all the time, our adrenal glands, which produce our stress hormones, become exhausted and burn out eventually. So we have to look at what serves us with regard to threats, and what's a real threat and what's an actual perceived threat. So one example of this in modern day life is our fear of rejection. So fear of rejection, when we think about rejection, we have this massive fear of it. When it comes to relationships, when it comes to being open and connecting with people, we fear rejection. When it comes to career goals, we think, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not qualified. I'm not going to apply for that job. I'm not going to apply for that promotion. I won't get it. John up the road will get it. When we constantly think, it's an irrational fear we have of rejection in our life. Sometimes we have to weigh it up. When we feared rejection in the past versus the reality of what actually happened and took place. Because sometimes the fear itself takes over and it stops us from progressing in our life. So, even with the fear thing there, if I'm really honest, going back to when I set up my own business, I had fear of failure, fear of putting myself out there, fear of being rejected, and then one day I was like, well, what's the worst that can happen? What's the worst that can happen? So the fear level went down, and when that level of fear reduced, I started to do better in business because it wasn't apparent as much in me as a person. So how do we combat negative thoughts? So firstly, with negative thoughts, it's really, really important to notice them. So when you're in a situation, whether it's at home, work, whatever, and you have negative thoughts, you're under pressure, you don't get on with your boss, your colleague, your partner, whatever the issue is, start to notice your thought patterns. We need to become aware of something first before we can do anything about it. So notice it. Notice how you think about certain things and the way you perceive certain situations around you. So become aware consciously of how it plays out in your own mind. Start to notice it in others. You'll start to notice people around you that you can't unsee actually after a while, where I call them Debbie Downers, negative Nancys, because everything is negative. For example, I was going to a course in Cork a couple of months ago, and on the way to the course, I could see the building where I was going to, and my car broke down on the side of the East Link or whatever it's called. And my car broke down and I could see the building, and I was sitting there and I was under time pressure, and I was like, okay, car's broken down. There's not a huge amount I can do here. So my husband was in Cork at the time. I contacted him and I said, oh, my car's broken down. Can you come and help me out? So instead of panicking, which the old me would have done, I decided I'd reply to some emails and listen to a podcast that I enjoy. So I was sitting having the giggles when he arrived, when I probably should have appeared stressed in his head. But for me, there was no point in appearing stressed or being stressed about the situation itself. So it wasn't going to serve me. So I ended up having a giggle at one of the podcasts I most enjoy. So again, it's changing the narrative a little bit for you in any given situation. Because in life, there's what happens we cannot control, but what we can control is how we handle it and how we react to it. So how do we change how we think? Okay. So it's it is difficult to change how you think. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to say it's easy. It's not, but it is possible. So if you know that even though it's not our fault that we're born with 80% of negative thoughts, you think, okay, we're starting off at a disadvantage. But it is possible to change our thought patterns and our thought processes. It does take time though. So consciously try and take in the positive every day. When we are thinking our normal thought pattern, it's natural. We're not even aware of it. Our subconscious does it. And that's why we're wired the way we're wired to the negative thought patterns. So knowing that our brain is wired to overlook the positive in favor of the negative, try to consciously take in the positive when it happens. When anything good happens, when it doesn't rain in Ireland at the moment, it's positive with the torrential rain that we've all had. So anything at all, focus on it, because what you're actually doing is you're training your neural pathways in your brain to start being aware of the positive, and you're consciously doing that. Okay, and it does take time. When something happens, take a moment and really try and take it in when something positive happens. So in today's world, a lot of the progression that we'll be making will be unlearning destructive thoughts that do not serve us. So it's hard to learn new stuff if you think you already know it. So a lot of people struggle to fathom that we need to unlearn a lot of destructive thought patterns that we've grown up to have. For example, on some of the courses that we teach, I usually put up, some of the older people here might remember it. There used to be a program called 40 Coats. And 40 Coats was this, I don't remember a huge amount about him, but he was this man who had 40 coats on. He was a character when I was younger. And the analogy is that we all grow up in different environments with different parents, different genes, and we all have different lenses to the world. And when we grow up, we learn a certain filter to the world. We learn certain patterns, we learn certain traditions that serve us and some that don't serve us. So as an adult, by having the 40 coats analogy or using the 40 coats analogy, it's really useful to remember, peel off the layers that do not serve you from your upbringing and keep the ones that do. So there's things like my parents did everything for us growing up, which means we had to learn the hard way when we became adults. So again, for my children, I want them to be a lot more independent than we would have been growing up. So again, there's some traditions and learnings that I keep, and there's some that I peel off and don't keep, that do not serve us. So just be mindful. Just because something's always been done a certain way doesn't mean that you always have to continue to do it that way because it's always been done that way. Have a think about what serves you as a person. So even when it, actually, just back to that for a second, even when it comes to putting in boundaries as an individual, you know, I met someone on a course who said to me she'd had a lot of trauma in her life, and she said to me she follows her gut instinct for everything that she does, you know, outside of the mandatory work and whatever. And she said, even down to going for a cup of coffee with someone, she said if she's asked to go for a coffee, she said the old her would be like, oh yes, of course, thank you so much for inviting me. But the new version of her would sit with it and ask herself, do I want to go for a cup of coffee with the person? And then close her eyes and have a minute and then sit, do I not want to? And then her gut instinct basically will give you the answer. So according to the Aborigines, we have 3 brains. So we have the gut, which is the biggest and most important. We have the heart, which is the second one in the loop. And we have the brain, which is the smallest. And where do most of us live most of the time? Here. We often try to apply logic to illogical situations, so therefore it doesn't fit. Okay, so when you learn something, what happens in the mind and in the brain? So when we learn something, we realize that it's difficult. So how many of you have ever tried to learn a new language, or a musical instrument, or even drive a car? So what happens in the mind when you start to do it? So say a language, for example, it's really, really difficult. At the beginning, you're learning the basic primitive words. You are struggling to connect them. You're thinking constantly about how it works, how you connect them, how you make very simple sentences. And with a lot of practice, you'll get some sentences out. And if you keep practicing, eventually it becomes second nature. It becomes part of your subconscious. It's the same with driving. At the beginning, you couldn't have had a conversation with someone while you were learning how to drive because you'd probably crash the car. Touch wood, you don't. But my point is, you're so focused. Your brain is learning something completely new, and you're so focused on it that you can't. You're basically creating a new pathway in your brain for this piece of information. And the better at something you become, the closer those senders and receivers in your brain get to one another. And as a result of that, it becomes your default way of thinking or being. So now driving a car, how many years on, 20 plus years I'm driving now, I wouldn't think about driving and I can have a full-blown conversation with someone, whereas at the beginning, you'd have probably set me over the edge trying to talk to me, and me with my foot permanently on the clutch incorrectly. But I was also trying to drive and put the pieces together, if that makes sense. Okay, so don't mind the big word here, automaticity. This word is basically gives us the ability to perform everyday tasks independent of conscious control or attention, like driving or speaking a language. So it's really important to remember when you do something like take in the positive, often enough, what happens is it becomes your default way of thinking. You're retraining your brain, okay? And when you retrain your brain, your quality of your life improves if you're retraining it for the positive, because already you're at a disadvantage with the 80% of the negative. So a person experiencing anxiety. So if you're a person that experiences anxiety and say panic attacks, for example, you go to your local store, your local shop, and you have a panic attack there. And you decide, I'm not going back there again because I triggered a panic attack. And then you go down to your local restaurant, you have a panic attack there, I'm not going there again. I had a panic attack there. So you don't want to be triggered. And eventually you get to a point where you decide that all these places have triggered panic attacks. Therefore, you're not going to go to them anymore. And all of a sudden you're dealing with another issue, which is agoraphobia, which is you don't want to go out. And it's your brain. The negative is overtaking the positive. So in reality, yes, you might have had a panic attack, but you made it there, you got what you needed to get, and you got out. Although the panic attack was uncomfortable, you survived it, you coped, and you handled it through the other side. So the words we speak become the house we live in. This is a very, very famous quote, and you have to remember we have one of five people, the one of five people in our lives that we have the most in our lives is ourselves, our inner voice. So again, you just need to be very careful of the self-talk in your mind about how you speak to yourself. If you're constantly running yourself down and speaking negatively to yourself, that has a very detrimental effect on your mental health. So language is a vehicle for emotion. So again, when you put, instead of me saying, or someone said to me recently, I'm very nervous about teaching. And they used the words nervous, which then created emotions and anxiety about teaching. So I said to them, okay, what about we change up the language? So yes, I'm really excited about my first teaching job, but I am a little bit apprehensive. So you're changing the narrative a little bit for your own self-talk, if that makes sense. Okay, so focusing on the positive. Excuse the strange looking image, but I like this image because it explains when we are moving to positive thought patterns, consider a tractor on a very, very 2-foot muddy laneway, really, really deep muddy laneway, and consider the tractor going down it for the very first time. It may not even get down the first time. It'll really, really struggle. It'll be very slow and it may not even get to the end. The second time will be similar, but eventually the tractor will get down the laneway and eventually the tractor will travel down that laneway with ease. And that's what it's like when we're changing our thought patterns, when we're practicing and focusing in on the positive of positive events that occur in our life. like having gratitude. When we are grateful, like little exercises that you can do is like make note each day of 3 things you're grateful for. Did you know that when our brain is like, if you can imagine an old house, so with our brain, it is, this neuroscientists have proven that when we are stressed or focusing on negative stuff in our life, it is an impossibility for us to have hope. So you cannot be stressed or very, very negative, and having, being conscious of perceived threats and have hope at the same time. So it's like me living, I used to live in a really old house in Cork, and putting on a hairdryer and putting on the fan tripped the switch. So because I couldn't use the two at the same time, I could only ever use the hairdryer on its own or the fan on its own. When you have stress in your life, you cannot have hope in your life. So just be mindful of that when you're constantly stressed. And that's another reason to look at your stress levels, look at the triggers as well, and how you respond to them. So again, just taking in the positive and shifting the focus, consciously changing the perspective. So stuff's going to happen. You're not going to be able to change it. But there's only one thing you can change, and that is your reaction and your response to it. Choose a time every day where you will deliberately sit down and make a mental note of the 3 things you're grateful for, as I was saying. A lot of people kind of go, oh, gratitude, okay, Louise. And I'm like, I understand why, and I'd be a bit like that as well. But until I saw the research, what it's doing is retraining your brain to look and be aware, be hyper aware for the positive and not the negative. And that's why it's so important. Okay, so your response to stress. So what is stress? Stress is any type of change that causes physical, emotional, or psychological strain. It's your body's response to anything that requires attention or action. So some terminology. A stressor is something that triggers stress. So your stress response is how you feel when you're exposed to a trigger. Okay. So how does your body respond to stress? Like your car, your brain has a little engine known as, you don't need to know any of this stuff, it's the autonomic nervous system, the ANS, so that's your engine. When you get stressed, it revs up and it floods the body with hormones that get the body ready for action. So your stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, okay? So this could save your life, and if you require immediate action from a danger, if someone's trying to hurt you, if you're under attack, if you need to run, it's basically floods your muscles with oxygenated blood to give you the energy to move and get out of the way of danger. So the response is fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, are the 4 different types of stress responses that we have as individuals. So the fawn one is quite a new one, but it's we all fall into different. We all have kind of dominant categories, and then we move into different ones at times. So signs to tell you are in the fight response include tight jaw or grinding your teeth, urge to punch someone or something, feeling intense anger, desire to stomp or kick, crying, glaring at people, upset tummy, or attacking the source of the stress. So I'm sure some of you can relate to the fight mode. That can be possibly your dominant mode. So again, there are things that if we're very reactive, this is how we'll respond when huge stress comes into our life. My dad would have a strong fight response to stress, in that I remember when we were younger, and when we used to like fall and hurt ourselves, there was 4 kids, we used to fall and hurt ourselves, and instead of coming out and lifting us up and giving us love, he used to shout at us for getting hurt. We used to be like, we're injured or we're sore and you're shouting at us. but that was his stress. I now understand he was in fight mode in his stress response because he was stressed because we were hurt. But obviously it didn't really serve him very well at the time, or us. Okay, so flight mode. The emotional and physical responses below signify you're in flight mode. Excessively exercising, feeling fidgety, constantly moving, restless body, sensation or numbing, and dilated eyes, darting as well. So again, you can have one dominant one, but you can move in and out of different ones. So try and figure out what one is relative to you as an individual. Freeze. So when you were in freeze response, it's the person that just freezes when something happens. About 10 years ago, where I used to live in Cork, a friend of ours collapsed and went unconscious, wasn't breathing. And another lady that lived in our street at the time was a doctor, and she froze. She froze, and nobody could believe or comprehend that she froze. That was her job in life, and everyone was very harsh on her reaction. But at the end of the day, the reality is she froze. She came from a house where there was domestic abuse, and the girl that collapsed was a good friend of hers. And nobody should ever judge anybody for their stress response, because sometimes if there's an argument or a row or something, and you hear people say, he just stood there, or I just stood there. I mean, and they judge the person for responding in the way that they did. And I would have done this if I would have, I'd have punched them, or I'd attacked them back, or whatever it was. It's actually an incorrect statement, because nobody has any comprehension what their stress response is in any situation unless they're actually in it. They don't know, because you don't know what it is. No matter if you're a heavyweight champion of the world and someone attacks you, you could still freeze. So you don't know what that person's situation is and where they're coming from. Fawning is a new one. And fawning is if you were, I don't know, in an office space and work, and say something, the roof fell in on part of the room. And it's the person walking around going, it's okay, don't worry guys, we'll get it sorted, don't worry, no one's stressed about it, it's okay. That's a fawner. So sometimes, like if you're a parent, if you're a mum, you will fawn, because that's what your child needs. If they hurt themselves, you fawn, it's okay, you're going to be okay, and you talk them through the process and you give them the skills to deal with it. So again, you could be in all sorts of distress yourself, but you have the ability to fawn for those around you. So you're it's a people-pleasing one for adults, but for a child, we're quite guilty of doing it as well for our kids. It's not a bad thing. It's better than being shouted at, though. So nowadays, the problem is our stress response is being activated far too regularly. Okay, so the constant perceived threat that we have. So what activates the stress response? The perceived threat. So fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of your financial situation, fear of your health, fear of something happening to your kids. I mean, the list is endless. And that constant fear, when people go on adrenaline constantly, and they're worried about this and they're worried about that, and at the end of the day, their stress response will only last for so long. And over a long period of time, when you hear people that are burnt out, people will burn out because their body gives up. If you don't take action to physically mind your head, it'll come out in your body. So your body will shut down, your body will go, no more, and you'll go into burnout mode. So self-imposed demands. A lot of us are very hard on ourselves. For me, it's usually I'm hard on myself about my IT skills. Or there's probably laughing there in the background, because I'm shocking. I try, I do my best with what I have, but I'm not gifted at it. And when I muck up, I go, this is typical, Louise. This is you getting it wrong again. And that's creates stress in me as a person. So whatever demands you place on yourself, I should go for that walk. I should get to the gym. I should cook a more nutritional meal, whatever it is. So I don't want you to get too caught up with this diagram, but this is basically a diagram of our brain in that how we respond to different things. So I've simplified it with this one. I like to think of the brain as a 4-story building. So when we think of the brain as a 4-story building, remember that everything comes in from the bottom. Everything arrives in through the brainstem. So you have your stress response is regulated at the bottom floor. It's responsible for your temperature, your respiration, your cardiac, but your stress response. You cannot travel to the floor above in your brain unless the floor that you're on is regulated. So when somebody is in full-blown anger mode, panic mode, think of a child having a tantrum. It is not possible to reach someone when they're in that mode because they don't have the ability to regulate their emotions when they're in full stress response. They don't have the ability to activate the smart part of the brain. So the cortex at the very top, floor 4, is the smart part of the brain. And if you think about it logically, until you have regulated each step of each floor, you don't get to the next level. That is why a lot of people with post-traumatic stress disorder can get triggered. So something happens, a noise can trigger them. It's usually a sound or a place can trigger them as well. So because they're in the first floor, so our ancestors thousands of years ago, our brain was not this developed. We didn't have all the floors. But now, because if we're triggered in floor 1 and we have no sense of time, so that person who has PTSD gets triggered and they can't get to the floor where the logical part of their brain is activated. So again, even in your work, if you are constantly stressed in your job, what happens is you are not functioning with the smartest part of your brain. And that gets a lot of people's attention because we all want to excel in work and do better and have career goals, etc. But if you are constantly stressed, you're not functioning at your best capacity. Okay? So why does the smart part of your brain get shut down when you're stressed? Because as we were saying there, you're unable to access the smart part of the brain until the stress response has been regulated. So we need to regulate that part before we can move up to the next part. So if you're angry about something, a good thing to do, a good expression given to me is, if in doubt, do nothing until you've calmed, because you're not regulated. And how you know you're regulated is when you can hear yourself breathe. So again, when you're very worked up, or if a child, as I said, a child is a good example, having a complete tantrum, just leave them. Safely, in a safe environment, leave them and let them have their tantrum until they calm and then communicate with them. So stressors can be internal or external. Fear, anxiety, insecurity, self-doubt, worry, etc. Catastrophic thinking. That everyone's out to get us. The world's gonna, be taken over by AI, whatever it is. Well, that's a possibility, I'm sure, as some people think. So all of these stressors exist in your mind. So they're not external. Therefore, the source of them is your constant companion. The only way to reduce your stress levels is, if its source is internal, is to reassess how you think, which will manage your emotional response. So why is it so critical to learn to manage our stress response? It is so critical because at the end of the day, if we are stressed all the time, there's only certain parts of your body that function when we're stressed. So only the essential parts, the non-essential parts don't function, they shut down. So again, you are not at your optimum health as well when you're fully stressed all the time. According to the World Health Organization, stress, according to research, can play a part between 75 and 90% of all human diseases. I'm not talking about mental, I'm talking about mental and physical human diseases. Up to 90% of diseases can be caused by stress. 90. Nothing, it supersedes everything. So again, if you're stressed all the time, you massively increase your risk factors for nearly every illness out there. So again, if you want to live a long and healthy life, look at your stress. Okay, so how to reduce low-level conflict in the workplace. This, I tell a lot of companies that I work with on this, it's all the stuff that doesn't make it to HR, it's all the stuff under that, but it's the daily stuff. It's the, everything from not getting on with a colleague, clashing with your boss, the team, people not playing fair on the team you're working on. So we all know what conflict is. Life, work life, family, or social life, we even have inner conflict. It can exist independently within our minds. So imagine what happens when you put multiple people with multiple filters working together. Can you imagine the potential for conflict? Huge, okay? Our minds create narratives about the world around us. They judge what others are doing and why they're doing it. Our minds can even create very elaborate stories about what they believe is being said or done, or even thought by others. So again, our minds are very, very guilty of having certain pieces of information and filling in the gaps. Okay, so you'll get a fact, something happens in work, out of work, it doesn't really matter, but you'll get a piece of information and then you fill in the gaps and then you create the story, even though you could be completely wrong. It is very important that our thoughts create our emotions, which motivates our behavior. So it's quite a serious thing to understand that, because if you don't understand that, you're constantly being motivated by the wrong emotions. If you're piecing together information that's not necessarily accurate to fill in the gaps, unless you have all the facts in place, it's really important not to act or respond, because at the end of the day, you could be completely wrong and you've created a huge amount of negative emotion in yourself on a certain situation, and you mightn't even be right in the first place. So the following metaphor explains this best. I don't know if there's a Buddhism kind of analogy on this, and it's called the DART system. So first darts are inescapable pains that life throws at us. So these are unavoidable pains that happen that are not within our control. It can be relationship breakdown. It can be a bereavement. It can be not getting a promotion. It can be, loss of a parent. It can be it can be anything like that. Not in control of those first darts. In reality, most of our suffering is not caused by first darts. It is caused by how we respond to them. Second darts are the darts we throw at ourselves. These are our reactions to first darts, and this is where much of our suffering lies. So second darts frequently trigger more second darts. How often have you argued with your colleague before you've even gotten into work? So we'll say John, who you work with, and he does your head in, we'll say, and you disagree on most things, and you've had a bit of an argument the day before, or he's annoyed you about something that you're working on. And how many times do people go away with the memory of what's happened, and have the argument continuously over in their head? And they could have argued with that person 3 times before they've actually got into work. And as soon as that person opens their mouth, they're ready for them. We've all done it. How many times have you brought the morning traffic into work? So again, people are, because when you're stressed, your cup is overflowing, and anything can basically affect you and impact your mindset. So how often have you brought work problems home for dinner? So again, something happens in work, it can dictate your whole day. So here is an example. For example, your colleague gets promoted for a job you both applied for. Your mind then creates a story about how you are not valued by your boss. It can be because the second dart, this is an example of the second dart, so the story that your mind creates. You're not valued by your boss. Is it because you were out for, a month for COVID last year? Is it because you were late because you're dropping the kids to school every, 3 days a week? Is it because you have kids? Is it because your colleague drives a nicer car than you, is it whatever the reason. The first start is, and the reality is, they get the promotion and you didn't. The second start is the story you create in your mind after the event, and how it impacts you. The actual situation gets distorted beyond measure, and you spend much of your time trying to understand why you didn't get the promotion. Your narrative, your self-talk affects your emotions, which in turn affects your behavior. Therefore, it is vital to become aware of what that voice in your head is saying. So start to listen. The voice we all have it, so I'm not mad here talking about it. We all have an inner voice. Start to listen to that voice and what kind of conversations it's having, what kind of narrative, what sort of things it's starting to discuss, what way it's affecting you. We all have a very bad habit, as I was saying, of creating stories to fill in the gaps of our knowledge. These stories are usually wrong, and they usually result in a lot of unnecessary suffering. So let's go back to the woman not getting the promotion for a minute. We call her Mary. So as a result of not getting the promotion, Mary becomes resentful and starts to disengage with her co-workers. The story she tells herself creates self-doubt, distrust in her boss. She's angry and she takes this home with her, and it affects all aspects of her job. She's not happy, she's off with her kids, she's a bit short with her husband, and this can all lead to a negative cycle of decline. So it starts to affect everything. What happened? Mary didn't get the promotion. That's a fact. Dart one. Everything else that stemmed from that was created by Mary's perception of what happened, which is Dart two. The magnitude of the problems can be created in basically mentally. The story that we create after the fact can have a catastrophic effect on our mental state. What's more is we have the power to change this narrative, this story that we tell ourselves. What can we do differently? Instead of resisting first starts, you should accept them completely. So something happens, something that's completely out of your control. What do? If you do have a tough breakup or lose out on a great opportunity, accept it and move on. It's our resistance to pain that causes our suffering. So the biggest gift you can do when it comes to any type of conflict is the fact, Dart one, that happens, accept it. Accept it, feel it, and move on. If Mary had sat with the disappointment and allowed herself to feel the disappointment of what happened and not got distracted by her mind, she would have basically got over it an awful lot quicker, and she would have handled it and been a lot more constructive in how she'd approached how she was feeling and people in her immediate surroundings. So control versus no control. Being able to differentiate between what is within our control and what is not is so important. Recognizing what is out of our control to release us from spending a lot of time and energy trying to change something that is completely out of our control. So this just is about a Holocaust survivor, Viktor Frankl. He is an author of Man's Search for Meaning. It's kind of one of the most widely regarded as one of the most amazing books of our time. Basically, it was how he couldn't change. He survived 4 concentration camps, and he couldn't change losing his family. He couldn't change where he was. He couldn't change anything. And yet his approach and how he handled it and his mindset, the one thing he was in control of was how he responded to the situation. If he'd got bitter and angry, like Nelson Mandela, similar fate, wrongly imprisoned in 1962, sent to Robben Island. If he let bitterness get in on his mind and take over his mindset, he would have come out a very different person. Instead, he came out and became one of the most iconic people of our time, of our lifetime. So research shows that fully feeling the pain of the first start diminishes its power. So basically, this creates space for us to choose how we respond when something happens. Something happens, feel it, sit with it, process it, before you move on, because if you don't, you'll create a story and all the hurt and negative emotions that come with it massively impact you and your direct environment, i.e. your family and partners. What I can control and what I can't. This is a really, really powerful diagram, image of what we're not in control of and what we are. The past. So what's out of my control is past, the future, actions of others, opinions of others. Who knew? What happens around me. And what I am in control of, my boundaries, my thoughts, actions, how I speak to myself is really important. How I handle challenges. But what I give my energy to is really important as well. If you focus all your energy on negative stuff, where's your mind going to be? There's only one place, which is a negative thought process. So understanding your conflict style. Do you enjoy conflict, or will you do everything in your power to avoid it? So it can help people reflect on how they've processed and handled things in the past and knowing what strategy they use. So it's even for managers to look at their own way of how they handle conflict and maybe learn what the best and most constructive process they need to apply for them going forward. Our responses to most conflicts is directly connected to both the nature of the relationship we have with the other person and ultimately what we want to get out of the interaction itself. How aware are you of your own conflict triggers? Ask yourself, what triggers you? And then become aware of the situations. So as opposed to going, responding or reacting even to a situation, go, oh, here, I'm being triggered here. What's coming up for me? And then it'll probably relate to something in your past, but at least you become aware of it. And by becoming aware of it, you can learn to respond differently. So the list is endless of what triggers, that's fine. 1 in 4 Irish employers experience a workplace dispute each year. The average employee in Ireland spends 3.3 hours a week dealing with workplace conflict. So conflict in the workplace, when it's left unchecked, is very, very destructive. And it's a massive cost for organisations if they don't handle it and teach people how to handle it. There's lots of causes of workplace in there's lots of things that create low-level conflict in the workplace. I don't have time to go through them all, but I just wanted to put them up there quickly for you. Loads of things. So we have habits, history, bullies, conflict perceptions, jealousy, competition, etc. So the balcony is a metaphor for a mental attitude of detachment. How we do this will differ from person to person, but it's basically trying to look down on the situation as opposed to being right in the middle of it, stepping back from it and perceiving it from the outside. So awareness is key. Sit down for 2 minutes and list the things that trigger you most in a professional work context. This will change over time. It's dependent on our level of emotional resilience and the particular context which we find ourselves in. It's really, really, really important. If you take one thing from today, take this. Take what triggers you. Make a list mentally or write it down of what triggers you and then start to become aware. And start to become aware of how you respond to it. Communication. When dealing with conflict, it is helpful to see the conflict as exposure of a problem that exists within the workplace. Identifying that problem is often half the battle. It's really, really important to be aware of basically handling it face on. Keep emotion out of it. And if you think you can't keep emotion out of it, don't do anything until you're able to keep emotion out of it. So make no assumptions when it comes to conflict as well. You're there, say you have two, if you're a manager or a supervisor, you're there to facilitate a conversation where everybody feels heard and understood. So 10 communication techniques to the workplace. I'm sure you know a lot of these. Ask open-ended questions. Adopt active listening. Empathy is really, really important. It's underrated actually in the workplace. Give and receive feedback. That's very important. A lot of managers will give feedback, but they won't receive feedback. So be concise. Body language is massively important. Allow others to finish before speaking, especially if you're more senior to them. It should be for everyone, but just to be mindful of it. So for difficult conversations, move towards the conflict, never step back. Avoid delaying the conflict could result in escalating the conflict. Act as if you do not know anything about the situation, even if you do. Keep it quiet. There's no need to fill in the gaps. So just take the facts are the facts. People create their own narrative about, you know, what that person meant or was thinking or whatever. The facts are the facts. Perception is everything in conflict. So what you have to kind of consider, what is the problem from their point of view, even though it's really difficult sometimes. I only applied it there in the last 24 hours to a situation and I had to bite my tongue and consider it. I like this slide, respond, don't react. So a lot of your stress is about you reacting. So if you just, your attitude, I won't say all the stress, but nearly all the stress is gone. Trying to look at it from a different perspective. So the 4 agreements, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with them. They were up in our fridge when we were growing up, but it's just something maybe worth checking out. Be impeccable with your words. Don't take anything personally, and don't make assumptions as well. So again, it's just to be aware of what they are. It's a thing we've always had growing up in our house. And guys, I just want to say thank you all so much for being here today and taking the time to listen to the presentation. I really, really appreciate it.